Hi, everybody. Okay. Hello, I hope everybody can hear and see me clearly. If you can hear me and you can see me very clearly, please just indicate with yeah, okay, John Matt just help me out here. Everything good from my end? Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, I can see you and then the sound is okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good to know. Thank you so much. We have some very people joining really early for today's webinar. I'm so glad. Thank you so much for joining us quite early today. It's really good to see everybody and see some regulars for our webinar again. And thanks for joining us for our webinar series. So just before we start today's conversation, we're just going to go a little bit over what Space Ops Africa is all about, what we do, our previous webinars, and also how you should look out for us. And today's topic is quite interesting. Like, it's really something that I'm personally passionate about, and I think everyone is going to learn a great deal. During the course of the webinar, as for just ground rules and some housekeeping, do try to keep your mics muted at all times. If you have any questions or any concerns, or if you want to maybe make a contribution or say something, we are going to have a time for contributions and discussion as well. So you could just put your questions on the chat box, or you could send your concerns directly to me if maybe you have any challenge or you want to ask a question. So feel free to make use of that as well. Feel very free. It's a very lively session. It's semi-formal, so this is not like a classroom setting. We just want to really have a nice dialogue. And so yes, that's for housekeeping, and let's just be respectful and very polite and just respect other people's times as well, as we would like to cover the topic within the time that we have, and also give our speaker a lot of time to engage with us as well. Okay, so just about Space Hubs Africa, we were founded in 2020, so we've been around for a while. We are a consultancy company, and we focus on providing educational, market policy and startup support services for industries and for persons that are looking into entering the African space market and the African space industry. Our founder, Kusuma, is a very experienced business business analyst, and he has a lot of experience in the European and the African space agents, African and European space industry as well, and African and European space programs. So we do this in the industry. We also provide outreach services as well, promoting space education and astronomy education. If you go on our website, you'll be able to see some of our work and our articles and our policy opinions on some of the trending issues in the African space industry. Very wide range of topics. Most of our efforts and our vision is really to provide this safe space and ecosystem for the space industry in Africa. So these webinar series are a means of engaging with people interested in the African space sector, especially young people, or those that may already be in this sector but are looking for a way to connect and collaborate with other people. So we provide this community for engagements in this space industry, and we are very glad to have successfully done so for a few years, and we are always happy to have people join our webinar series. Yeah, as for what is going on with us, the new Space Horizon conference is coming up in a few days, just I think very early next week, and in Egypt, in Cairo. We're very glad to be a part of that event. Our founder, Kusuma, is going to be one of the speakers for that event. So you can just watch out for updates from us from the new Space Horizon conference. About today's session is very interesting, and it's about space communication primarily. So there are two aspects to this discussion. We'll talk about how do we communicate space to other people, because one thing, if you're a space expert, maybe you're an engineer, you work in a space agency, or you're studying aerospace engineering in university, or you're interested in space law policy, you're a lawyer, whatever field or profession you find yourself in the space sector, you must have noticed that the space industry is a very close-knit community. So a lot of our discussions are within the community, and we use lots of technical terms. Most times abbreviations are not even bothered to be explained. If you attend a regular space webinar, you hear things like EO technology, this ISS, and they are just these terms and these statements that are quite peculiar to the industry that only people in this industry can understand. But what happens when we are trying to engage younger people or non-technical audience, or you're trying to pitch a business to other people? Space is so far-fetched in the African context. We have to accept that it is. So this session is really about just discussing how can we strategize, how can we make sure that we are communicating clearly and effectively, because no matter how good the industry is, nobody really cares about our satellites. Nobody cares about your satellites, and nobody cares about like what wonderful things you're doing if they don't understand the everyday impact of this. So this is what this session is about, and it's also about providing you with the tools and some tips on networking within the industry. And hopefully we inspire a new generation of African space communicators like myself and my very good colleague, Mr. John Mark Ochen. And about our expert and speaker for today, Mr. John Mark Ochin. He's the Corporate Communications Officer of the Kenya Space Agency. And we know that Kenya Space Agency is quite one of the thriving space economies in the African space sector generally. They're doing a lot of amazing work there. And Mr. John Mark Ochin, he communicates space in a way that's kind of relatable to everybody. He writes opinion pieces. You can check him out on LinkedIn. Mr. John Mark, if you don't mind, maybe sharing your LinkedIn, maybe link or something much later on so people can comment, like, and follow. And he shares papers, articles, trying to explain the importance of space and astronomy for the general African society. So we are quite happy to have him here join us today. So that will be all from my end. And if you have any questions, like I said, for the rest of the webinar, please don't forget to reach out to me and just maybe send me a message or send a message to the group chat and be ready to attend to you. So I'll be handing over to Mr. John Mark Ochen now. If you don't mind maybe sharing your screen. Just let me know if it works well.
Yes, Nelly, I am sharing the screen in a moment.
Okay, that's fine. Absolutely okay. And I'm just going to see who we have here and do some shout outs. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I see most of our regulars coming in a few minutes late, but we're just glad you're here. Dr. Johanna, always good to see you. Thanks for coming. And Consolation Ajero, that should be my very good friend Akuna. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming, Hassan. Thanks for coming, George. And Sylvester and Claire. It's really good to see all of you here. And maybe I'll do more shout out later. But now I'm going to hand over to Mr. John Mark. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nelly, for the introduction and, of course, giving an outline of what Space Hubs Africa does. And just like you mentioned, space communication is something that has been overlooked from the African perspective. And this can also be seen if you do a random survey. Just do a random search online and see how many space communicators or science communicators we have from Africa. So it's a countable number. And this is why we need to start having these conversations around space communication. Because really, anytime you are in a context where people are talking about space in Africa, it's usually that it's a foreign concept. It's something that Africans are not familiar with. But then the idea is starting to have these conversations, because when we have conversations, people actually do listen. And the more people talking about this specific aspect of the space ecosystem, especially from an African perspective, the more people will get to learn and know about it. So it's all I'd say a space race, but in a different angle altogether. because in the 1960s we had the space race by the US and the Russians, and this is where everyone was rushing to make a mark. So at the beginning, it was really about the competition aspect. But then after the US won this space race, then now they were like, what next? So maybe it's time we start asking ourselves from the African perspective, what's next for us and how can we tap into the very famous $1 trillion space economy or global space economy, which is also expanding and growing every single day. So without further ado, I would like to start going with the presentation, and just let me know if you can see the screen.
Yeah, it looks really good from my end.
Okay. So the title slide and the conversation that we are having today is down to earth, which can also be looked at from two different angles. So it's literally down to earth, and then it's the figurative down to earth, where you have to really assess within you. So it's also how we are going to be bridging space and society through effective communication. Uh, and just to go back to the space race, if you check your history or if you're into the history of the space race, most of the time it's usually NASA, Russia. And so this means that NASA were not really the first in many of these things or many of the achievements in space. It was actually Russia. Russia sent the first one to space. Russia sent the first satellite to space. But NASA was so good at communicating their achievements that they overpowered the work or the many firsts that the Russians did. So that is essentially uh, what happened. So we have an introduction slide, and yeah, just some information where I am a passionate space communicator and communications professional. Uh, and of course, this is the part where you get to sell yourself, and we'll get to see this when we get to this the section where it talks about elevator pitches. So I'm dedicated to promoting Kenya's and Africa's roles in the global space community. And this is really done through communication. So a little backstory. I have a background in journalism and mass communication. So ideally, anyone who does a course like that in university, from the Kenyan perspective, is this person would either venture into politics, entertainment, or showbiz, and that is it. But then being a space enthusiast, I started thinking, I am passionate about space and everything that comes with it. And then I also have journalism and mass communication up my sleeve. So why don't I marry the two and then see what the impact that I can make? And so recently there's a certain phrase I like using where if you put the word space in front of any career, then you get a space career. So that is also a point that will come when we get later in the webinar. So that is some bit of introduction. So why is communication important in the space sector? I feel like when you do a random search online about space communication, then most of the time you'd get the communication between satellites and Earth. So that's satellite communication. But really what we are referring to when we say communication in the space sector is talking about space or starting conversations around the space ecosystem. So why does this communication matter? It's because there is a disconnect between technical space advancements and public understanding. So how does this happen? We have scientists, and I'm sure some of them are in this meeting or this call, and we have astrophysicists. So these are people who have dedicated their education and life learning about their areas of interest or their areas of focus. And what they do is they use jargon that is familiar to them. And this jargon that is familiar to them is not familiar to the layman. So that creates a huge disconnect between the technical space advancements and public understanding. So it gets to a point where, and this is, I'd say, a practical scenario is the Kenyan context or even the African context. Most of the people never knew that the space race in Kenya started in the 60s. Why? It is because how it was communicated back then, it used the technical language that no one really uh, cares about because they have bigger problems to deal with. And then, so how does effective communication drive public and governmental support for space initiatives? So when it comes to policy and governance, then we have decision makers, and these decision makers are not us in the space sector, or they're not anyone else in the public sector. It is people in top offices in the government. So ideally, if you want to get funding, or if you want something to get that public traction from the decision makers and the policy makers, then we would have to find a way to convince them why this is important. And this is where effective communication, and we'll get to see that uh, by the end of this presentation, we'll get to see how that manifests. So the disconnect, and then how can we bridge that disconnect? So next, I will just quickly dive into the strategies for non-technical communication. And this is basically the steps in which, or the methods which you can use to communicate effectively. And of course, this is industry specific, which is the space sector, but then you can adapt it to any other. So whether you're into nuclear physics, whether you're into any other form of science, there are practical strategies that could help a lot. So it cuts across. So the first one is storytelling, where you use real life stories to illustrate the impact of space technologies. And then we have the simplifying concepts. And like I said earlier, most of the scientists are used to the technical jargon that people don't understand. And then we have the relatability, where if you want someone to take in the idea that you're selling, you have to convince them why it matters. Why should they care about whatever you're saying? So at the bottom of this page, I have two illustrations. So one, there's a fork and it has a spaghetti rolled on it. And then there's an illustration of a black hole and then the word spaghettification. So this is an analogy, another way of explaining technical jargon in a way anyone else can understand. So just to step aside from it a bit, anytime someone doesn't understand, and I think this is something that has become adopted nowadays, is if they don't understand it, they'll tell you to explain it like they are 5 years old. So this black hole, anytime something is getting into the black hole and it can't escape, the process is called spaghettification. It is the point where you get stretched, or an object gets stretched as it passes the event horizon. And the event horizon is the boundary around the black hole. So this process being called spaghettification, it's easy to relate it to someone eating spaghetti, your mouth being a black hole, and then that process is your spaghettifying yourself. And then the other illustration is space, it can be related to the ocean. And this comes in where you have the space environment and then you have the deep seas. Uh, So for both, anyone who's exploring space and anyone who's exploring the ocean, they'd have to have a special suit. And these two also, for you to access them, you have to have a special vessel. So they're relatable. And this is how you can try and relate complex ideas to people who cannot understand. So under relatable, we have connect space applications to local issues like agriculture, health, or disaster management, which are the main thing that we Africans really feel like they matter to us. So, and the next slide is also just examples of impacts for space technologies, the socioeconomic impacts that directly affect the community. So in the first picture is an image where satellite imagery was used to expand crop insurance in Kenya. And I can share this slide or the link to it. So this was through a partnership between Savi, Eastern and Southern Africa, and the Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture, where satellite-based crop mapping system and methodology was developed to streamline the data collection. And then in the next picture, we have using space technologies in Mozambique to better respond to natural disasters. These are direct impacts. And the fact that someone can make predictions about what impact is going to happen next to maybe the environment or the community, it makes it very important for people to know that these exist and these are some of the ways that these technologies have been used. So even when you're trying to talk to decision makers, whether you are a research student and you're trying to get funding, it really helps to have the data and the facts of how it has been used, how practical it was, and how you can adapt it to the current, the current problem or challenge you're trying to solve. So if anyone has a question, you're free to interject or just throw it in to the chat because I am known to talk a lot nonstop. So we will quickly go to the next slide. And this is the part where we have you crafting an elevator pitch. So an elevator pitch, just as is written in the slide, it's a persuasive speech that you can use to spark interest in what you or your organization does. And the reason why it's called an elevator pitch is because it should be concise enough to deliver during a short elevator ride, which usually lasts between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on how high the building you're in is. So the goal of this elevator pitch is to quickly and effectively communicate the key information. You need to grab that listener's attention and then leave a lasting impression that leads to a follow-up or further conversation or action. And the practicality of this is, say you're at a conference, and here in Kenya, we have the Kenyatta International Convention Center. So you've attended a conference there, and then by chance or luckily, you get to share the elevator with a CEO from a leading climate company in Kenya, and your organization deals with satellites and how they impact climate change. So how are you going to pitch your idea for this short elevator ride in a way that this person will remember and this person will not remember? Oh, this was that person who had a lot of stories to tell. So how can we do this? So here we have some of the elevator pitch essentials where there is conciseness, there's the audience focus, and then there's the relevance. And these words are pretty straightforward, but then they're not really straightforward if you think about them, because we don't just want to throw these words around without thinking or worrying about what you say. So the conciseness is keeping the message short and to the point. And when we come to that is pretty straightforward. And then the audience focus. Tailor your pitch to the interest and concerns of your audience. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where your company deals with climate change, but then you're talking to someone who deals with maybe navigation. So it's not the right audience. Sure, it can be a good idea and you can have the best pitch, but always think about the person you're pitching to. And then the relevance, highlight the direct benefits of your work or the technology being discussed. So do not sugarcoat anything. Do not beat around the bush. Be as direct as you can, and of course, being respectful. And we have this picture where there's a quote or it's an illustration of someone speaking or making an elevator pitch. So you meet someone and then you go, space technology isn't just about exploring stars, it's about improving life here on. So whether it's in agriculture, healthcare, or disaster management, this is how we are using it. So there are different iterations to this, or there are different ways you can craft this. But then the idea really is to grab their attention and follow up or yeah, you need to make that person remember you so that even when you follow up, they're like, oh, I remember you. You're the one who had this great pitch when we shared. So the elevator pitch is closely tied to networking strategies because the same things or the same strategies that we have talked about in the when you're making an elevator pitch also apply when you're networking. So networking is basically a vital skill, especially in the space industry where connections often lead to new opportunities, collaborations, and insights. And before I even dive further into this, I just want to share a personal story. So I have been to conferences, and through networking and following up and leaving an impression, I landed my first job. I still continued doing the networking and attending these conferences and collecting the business cards because networking is not about just collecting business cards and keeping them as decorations in your wallet. So it's about building these meaningful relationships that can advance your career. So by attending these meetings, I ended up landing many other opportunities and even my career. So when you master the art of networking, you can connect with industry leaders, you can share your ideas and open doors to new possibilities, exploration, and innovation. And I know it's easier said than done, but you have to decide that this is what you want to do. You have to have an end goal in mind, and then there's no motivation that. So some few tips for networking is there's the active listening. And active listening is not just about hearing what others say, but you also need to respond thoughtfully to build that relationship and understanding. Because you don't want to be talking to someone and then you answer something that they did not say. So you truly engage with them by listening and responding. And then we have the insightful questions. We all have questions. We are all curious. And maybe this is the point where the phrase curiosity killed the cat doesn't apply to you because it will if you don't think strategically about it. So when you ask questions that show interest and knowledge about what you're asking about, then this other person or this person you're talking to will have had the interest to actually listen to you and maybe answer. So well considered questions demonstrate genuine interest and knowledge, and this helps in the long term. And then the next tip is follow up. Always follow up. So you need to build and maintain these relationships by following up after initial meetings. So you get a business card, and like I mentioned earlier, it's not a decoration for your wallet. It's actually a point where you get home, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, but you just write and say, this is me. We met earlier. We talked about this. It would be nice to be in touch. And this way you keep that. That is how now you build the relationship. And then now it gets to a point where if you're a student, after you have graduated and you networked with someone somewhere, it could be HR, it could be a manager, it could be the CEO. So you have a better opportunity to remind them that this is who you are, where you met, what you talked about, and now you go ahead to say what you want or share the idea that you have. Because each and everyone out there will always have time to listen to a good idea. And good ideas come with the steps that we had talked about. The steps that we had talked about in crafting compelling elevator pitches. So the next slide is on inspiring the next generation. And this is now to the professionals who have their own companies and also you as a professional in the space industry. So it doesn't matter whether you're invited to a forum to speak. It doesn't matter whether you've gone to school to undertake a water rocket launching activity. So the future of Africa's space industry lies in the hands of the next generation. And You can also do a survey where if you look at most of the conversations going around space elsewhere, you'll find that it's mostly young people and young entrepreneurs that are actually venturing into the new space economy. So how do you engage the youth? This can be through internships, outreach programs, space clubs. So internships is it is where you as a young professional can apply for this internship at a certain company that you want to be. Or you as an employer can offer internship opportunities for people to actually learn from the job. So it's a hands-on experience that motivates young minds. So if then internship period lapses, then they have a better or they're in a better position to decide if that is what they want or they want to take it from a different angle. And then there's the outreach program. We have the where you organize workshops, webinars, and dialogues like this one, space themed events. And all of these involve inviting guest speakers who are experts to share their experiences. And what that happens is it ignites the curiosity. And there's just something about capturing when they are young. I'd say I am where I am, and most of us are where we are because we were very curious and we were inspired at some point in our lives to actually go for what we want. And then finally, we have space clubs. Oh, and back to the outreach programs, there are so many companies in Africa that are doing this. So we have them in Kenya, we have them in South Africa. They're all over. And I really love what they're doing. You see, if you have these outreach programs, it is an avenue for you to reach even more people, to make more connections and networks that will benefit you in the long. And then finally, on inspiring the next generation, we have the space clubs where you establish space clubs in schools and universities and even communities. So these clubs can organize talks, stargazing sessions, and space related. So I added the communities part last minute because I had a conversation with a young person recently, and he was telling me about how he wants to do something for his local bike community. So they cycle together and they have this club. So how do we also have a space club like that where you meet and then you do different activities that are space related? And again, you can interject or just throw the question in the chat. So the next slide is on leveraging digital platforms. So you have already learned about these networking strategies, elevator pitches, the strategies for non-technical communication, but really the power is in your hands. And in photography, it's usually said that the most powerful camera that you have is the one that is in your hand. So whether it's your phone, whether it's a professional camera, or whether it's a digital camera that you have just. So social media is also something that is in your hand, and it is a powerful tool for reaching and engaging an audience. And once you learn how to effectively use the different platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, Meta, and TikTok, then you can amplify your message about space technologies, about your projects, about your ideas and their benefits. And so the focus here is really on creating engaging, shareable content that captures attention and encourages interaction. So this was a very critical point because again, mostly I'll just do a comparison with the different content creators that are out there who make space content. Not many of them are African. So how can we make it African centered so that if I want to learn something about a recent discovery made in astrophysics or a different uh, or a new innovation idea or idea that has been made in Earth observation, what's to stop me from going to Nelly and watching her videos online and actually sharing? So all this starts with you. And so the different kinds of content that you can use, this is just an outline, is you have infographics where you summarize complex ideas into easily digestible format. and then short videos, which is pretty obvious. You have YouTube Shorts, you have TikToks, you have Instagram Reels, and then you also have the interactive posts. So you don't just post for the sake of it unless you're starting. And then you'll see what kind of content people engage with more, what kind of content people react to. And then now from that, go through the analytics, you get to learn how you can re-strategize. And then of course, there's a leveraging different platforms. So here I also put just a few, but my favorite of the three is LinkedIn. And this is because it's ideal for professional networking and sharing detailed articles or reports, which I do actively. And then it is also great for connecting with industry experts and potential collaborators. So your next job might be one LinkedIn connection away. And then we have Twitter or X, where it is useful for quick updates and being in touch with a broader audience. So the advantage of this is that it is timely, and then your idea can really take off if you learn how to utilize it well. And then we have TikTok. We all love TikTok. We all love people dancing, but how can we make it space? And it was a short slide because this really was about you, the listener, where you get to interact and ask what you want to know. And to conclude, is effective communication is crucial. This is a summary of what we have gone through so far. So effective communication is crucial for the success of space initiatives. And I've put NASA in brackets because earlier on, I had mentioned how NASA was so good at their communication that they have become a big league until now, compared to the Roscosmos or compared to other competitors. So they invested a lot of money in their space program, and they also invested in how they were communicating about their achievements. And then we have the strategies to make space relevant include non-technical communication and impactful storytelling, and then the importance of inspiring and the next generation of space communicators has also been highlighted because it is really, you catch them when they're young, and then you get to make an impact through them. And since most of the audience are younger people, I'd say this is also something that you can start on your own. And so what do we need to do? We need to encourage participation in reshaping the narrative around space in Africa. It is not a foreign concept. There have been satellites launched from Africa. There have been rockets launched from Africa. But how do we continue to make this a conversation that we have on a daily basis? And then there's a tiny quote where space exploration is a powerful reminder that innovation thrives when we bridge the gap between technology and everyday life. By communicating effectively, we not only advance our knowledge, but also transform our world for the better. So this is just a food for thought and something for you to think about at the end of this session. And so that was my last slide. And again, thank you for your attention. We can dive to a Q&A session and maybe I'll hand it back to Nelly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. John Mark Orchard. Spoken like a true space communicator, like just covering all of that in about 30 minutes. Completely amazing. Thank you so much for the dialogue. And I don't know, I don't think I can see your screen. I don't think your camera is on at the moment. So just making sure it's not from my end. Okay, great. Yeah, I can see you now. Thank you so much for that presentation. Quite very interesting and very down to earth as expected. And I'm just really going to throw the floor open for questions. If you have any concerns, we'll be very glad to take your questions. You can just signify by raising your hands using the link using the icon, I'm sorry, or you can also send a message to the chat. And if you have any questions, in the meantime, I'm just going to keep the conversation going with Mr. John. So I think quite interesting how you mentioned and talked about storytelling and just communicating via storytelling in very non-technical terms. And I was going to just ask a question about particularly people that are not in urban areas. We understand that most of the space projects and most of all the conferences and all the events and everything relating to space are usually done in like the urban area. So in terms of like audience reach, are there any particular demographic issues you're seeing, maybe how we're trying to let people know about space, and how do we really consider those in the rural areas? How do we make this in a way that relates to them? Should I even be concerned about this kind of conversation, or should we just say as long as they benefit from it, internet connectivity, they don't really need to know the details? How do we go around such issues?
Okay, so I see two hands as well.
Yeah, two
So
hands up. Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I am going to answer your question and then maybe we can just
Yeah,
proceed
absolutely.
that way.
We'll take Mr. Etim and then we'll take Johanna right after that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you should ask that because I think I intended to touch on it, but then it slipped my mind. So it so happens that space is for all, and one way or another, everyone benefits from it.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, benefits from it. So how do we bridge this gap between, and you see, like you pointed out, most of these space conferences will happen in maybe urban areas or more developed areas. So how do we ensure that it gets to the people in the rural areas? So the strategy that I usually use is it is always a teachable moment when it comes to space communication. So I've had scenarios where I am using maybe in a rural area, and then I'm using the means of transport that is available there. And then somehow the conversation ends up getting to something that this person saw at night. So it could be that they saw a meteor, because I remember this one time we saw the lights. I was with a person in the rural area, and then we saw a light in the sky, but it was a tail light from a chopper. So this conversation turned into something that he saw at night, and he didn't know what it was. So I was like, this is a teachable moment. And then I went on to explain how there's two things. It could either have been a satellite or a meteor. And then
mm,
that also goes into explaining what they are, because the idea is there's really a lot of benefit when it comes to the transfer of knowledge, because
yeah,
them knowing that the next time they see a similar phenomenon, they'll go and brag about it to their friends because they know about it. And
yeah,
then it will just start a chain reaction of
yeah,
such communication. So true, they
absolutely.
cannot, yeah, so true, they cannot get access to these conferences, but then they can still get access to,
To the knowledge.
yeah. And just the strategies that I had highlighted earlier, they always work and they can fit in
Yeah,
any scenario. Yeah. I
yeah.
hope that
Right.
answers you, Nelly.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. Just seeing that chain reaction, like you mentioned, and having teachable moments. And I think one important thing about all you've said so far is that space literacy matters even for those in the rural areas. Space literacy is quite important because they have children, and we don't want to make the industry or knowledge so elitist that even those young ones in the rural areas can make up. And this is why this conversation is so important. Thank you for pointing that out. Mr. Aiton, please just go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Nelly, but please forgive me. Dr. Leda's hand was up before mine, so
Oh,
let him go for
I
it, please.
no, no problem, Dr. Johanna. No problem. However it goes, Dr. Johanna, do you mind? I don't know how we'll sort it out. Dr. Johanna, if you don't mind, you can go first, or you can let Mr. Aiton go first, so whichever works.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelly. Thank you, Etin, for letting me go first. John Mark, I'm a big fan of your uh, LinkedIn posts. I really like the way you break down those complex things into interesting, posts that people from all backgrounds can really interact and grasp um, what is supposed to be delivered. So my question really is the issue of language.
Mm,
Uh, how can we, deliver these uh, complex messages to our local communities? For example, here in Tanzania, our communities use Swahili rather than English. I think it's also
yeah,
the same in Kenya to some extent. So these our local languages are somewhat not that developed to contain enough vocabularies and all that. So how do we really navigate around this challenge?
yeah,
Uh, I can see my mentor, Dr. Nurali. I think you also had you also have worked a bit around how to deliver these messages in our local languages. Maybe you can share some uh, inputs on that as well.
yeah. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out, Johanna. Yeah, quite an interesting point. And maybe Mr. 18, maybe you could go and then John Mark could take the questions together. And we are still taking more questions, everybody. Please send your question to the chat box or raise your hand. I will be happy to hear your question or your contribution to the dialogue.
Okay, thank you, Nelly, and thank you, John Mark, for the great presentation. Communication is really an important issue within the space sector and generally on a global level. I don't know whether my question is falls within the scope of the discussion, but let me just throw it there and let's see whether maybe the conversation can extend to that side. First is about communicating with people who, I don't know which is the better word to use, but they have something like an antagonistic position to your position. And first of all, if you look at it from even within the space sector, so typically within the space sector, those who are in military space tend to get more government funding than those who are doing civilian space. So how can those who are doing science or civil communicate with those who are doing more of the military stuff? Because there's that tension that happens even within the space sector. And then if you now go outside the space sector too, there's always this issue of why put so much money into space when there are other issues that need to be resolved. So how do you also communicate the benefits to those who are, if I may use that word, on the other side, and also let them see that they also benefit even from the space investment? That's the first question. Then the second question is, how do you build what you may call a national narrative around space? So let me give you an example of what I mean. If you look at the US, there is this narrative about we are the leaders in space, leaders in space in everything, and the US must continue to lead. So in our different countries, how do we build a narrative, whatever that narrative could be or should be? How do we build a national narrative around space? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Aitim. I think those questions are spot on. I think they are spot on to the discussion. And Mr. John Mark, are you ready to go?
Yes, Nelly. So I will tackle the first question about the language barrier in a nutshell, because that is essentially what Dr. Leiza had raised. So how do we bridge this language barrier? So there are not really many translations that have been made when it comes to having such technical conversations. So it would be very hectic trying to break it down in a way that they can understand. And so there are a couple of companies or initiatives that are working towards trying to translate research papers into local African languages. And yeah, and this is also it's something you can do a random Google search, but they're trying. I also know someone called Carrington Kinyanjui. Maybe you can also check him out. So they have these projects where they go to the communities deep inside or in the deeper parts of Kenya, and then they try to speak about theoretical physics. They speak about astronomy, because before space became a global thing, it was a community thing. And how they used to pass around this knowledge, it was transferred from one person to the other. So their typical setup is they would gather around a campfire and then they would tell stories about maybe how, and like I said earlier, using the analogies. So they would say how the moon, they would give these different phenomena personalities. And this is because we relate more to personalities because we might feel that we understand it if something seems like it can be understood by us. I don't know if that makes sense, but a scenario where you say that what caused the moon and the sun once existed at the same time in the night sky, and then one day they had an argument, and so the moon went to hide on the darker side of Earth, and that is why the moon just comes out at night and the sun goes, you know. So
We
there's
have those
no,
stories in Nigeria as well. I think it's an African thing.
yeah. So there's no direct way to translate these physical concepts because how do you even begin if you're not an expert in that field? But then talking to communities, and then this also doubles down as research. So you as the person who understands it, it is upon you to now try and find a way in which you can break it down or in which you can translate it if you have to. But the most ideal and the most sure way to go about it is to try and relate it to something that they are used to.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
Dr. Liz, unless there's a follow-up question, Nelly.
yeah, just to before you go to Mr. Atim's question, just building
Yeah.
up on Dr. Laser's question again. I think another concerning thing for me would be some of these folklores, they're not scientifically accurate. It's quite
Yeah.
sensitive because let's say you're speaking Swahili or you're using Igbo or Hausa, then how do you correct the narrative? I think correcting the narrative in the process of communicating with them is quite important, but then you have to be culturally sensitive as well. So this line, how do we navigate all of this as space communicators?
Yeah, so this is now a personal initiative that goes to us as space communicators or aspiring space communicators and educators, because you're the one who knows this, you're the one who knows what's missing, and it is upon you to now try and find a way to get that message out there in a way that they will understand. So assuming that your English, of course, is universal, and most of these studies are being done in English. But then there is someone in maybe Dr. Laser's case, Tanzania, they only speak Swahili. So how will you relate these two? Because there's a huge language. So it really is a personal initiative, and it is upon us as communicators.
Yeah.
But again, you can do you can do, if that is something that you're passionate about, you can do a random search, science in the African context. There are so many people who are already doing this. And I think even people who design large language models, so like ChatGPT, Gemini, they're also trying to integrate these local African languages into these models. So it's something that is evolving. It is evolving fast, and it is promising.
Yeah. Thank you. Great.
Next to Mr. Etim's question. The first one was communicating with people who are antagonistic towards developments in space. And he raised an important aspect of maybe the government pumping so much money when it comes to military uses of space, but then they ignore the more civil uses. So earlier on in the during the presentation, I had mentioned that there are policymakers who are usually the people you would want to convince the most. And I will also tie it down to that aspect of an elevator pitch. These people, they do not want stories. They do not want you to go around corners. They do not want you to tell them about what happened, how it happened. What they want is, and again, there's this saying that people say that most people ignore or are afraid of what they do not understand. So I think the first step is make them understand. You're a communicator, or you're someone who is passionate about something, say Earth observation or GIS. You want funding to be pumped into agriculture or disaster mitigation methods. How do you get the government to fund that? You have to do like a comprehensive research, or you have to do something convincing that would be able to sort of shift their mindset. Because there's no one in this whole world who will just say, this is what I believe and it is final. I am not open to suggestions. And I also feel like you have the power of being aggressive with how you're communicating. Really make them understand. And again, it's easier said than done. But the whole idea is to have a sit down with them, make them hear you, and see the importance in. Because Mr. Etim, if you see the military, or if we relate the military aspect, someone would see there are other countries that are threats. And so if we pump money into having missiles or launch capabilities for that specific purpose, then we are better off. Nothing can stand against us. But then a few months or a few years later, people are dying from floods. People are dying from droughts.
Yeah.
So putting these facts, it's like a weighing scale. You weigh which one is the most important. The possibility of having a military attack as compared to the possibility of flooding and drought, taking into consideration that climate change is happening and is happening fast. Then the side of these natural disasters outweigh the military uses. So how do we make them understand this? And my go-to would be being aggressive with that communication. Sort of not demand, but respectfully look for a sit down and make them hear you. It's almost as if whenever we want to get hard, and this is so funny, whenever the economy is struggling, things are not going the way we plan, people usually stage protests. And at the end of these protests, you find that the government will be ready to listen. But we don't want to say that the space community is large enough to have a protest to the point where you get the attention of the government. But actually doing this, getting their attention in a different way would be.
Yeah, just thinking about the protest, that's why I'm laughing. Yeah, quite. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it happens almost everywhere, and the protest ever work, but it doesn't really. It's not the best way to go, but the idea really is to have a sit down, get them to listen. And then Mr. Eti also raised a second question where he asked, how do you build a narrative around space? And the narrative that NASA built, or the US built, is that they are the best. And rightfully so, they won the space race. So that gave them an upper hand at being the best, as they claim. So I think a narrative would be, this is Africa. I don't know if saying that a marginalized continent would be politically correct, but a narrative behind, okay, so it could be something like still we rise. So despite all the adversity, despite all the things that came with the colonialism,
Colonialism, yeah.
yeah, we have still emerged to send over 60 satellites across the board into
Yeah.
space that are actually working. We have different initiatives. And again, Africa has some of the best skies for maybe astronomy related uh, ventures. Africa has a lot of potential when it comes to space capability. And so the narrative could be around this, more of like how different countries rely on their wildlife, how vast their wildlife is, then can we come collectively and say that we as Africa, we have these initiatives that make us also the, yeah, and I see Mr. Etim has raised his hand. So, Mr. Etim?
Yeah, Mr. Aiton, please.
Okay, yeah, just to build up on two things that have come up. So let me rephrase the issue of narrative,
Mhm.
because you made a comment that the US won the space race. That in itself is a narrative.
Mhm.
So yeah, so the question I want to paraphrase now, it's for Africa, how do we change some of the negative narrative in Africa? So for example, Africa is undeveloped, so we should not venture into space, or we don't have the capability to do things related to space. So how do we change that narrative? Of course, you can look at it from different angles, as far as the young children, but also even to the national level. And then maybe after you respond to that, I don't know whether Dr. Jiwaji will want to speak, because he's done a work relating to something about Swahili, putting some space words in Swahili language. I don't know whether he will want to share about how he went about that.
Yeah, that'll be
Maybe
lovely.
that may inspire some other people to see what they can do in maybe their own local language or something. Thank you.
Okay, so I had totally looked at the narrative issue from a different perspective. And like Mr. Etim said, there are different perspectives to it. But I'd say most of the time when we have these discussions is we focus on the negatives. So what if we adopt a method where we only make noise about the positive sides? And the positive sides is in a certain year, say the 1970s, maybe there was no African country with a satellite. Fast forward to many years later in 2024, countries are launching satellites that are functional, or at least they're showing that they're able to do it through missions that aim to test that capability. So I think the narrative is changing how we look at it from a negative perspective and trying to look at the successes, because really the successes outweigh the negatives. But then I guess it's a matter of people losing hope or people thinking that we are not capable of it, that you just find that they are always pessimistic about something. So you find a situation where a country would want to invest into building a satellite that would predict or would be able to mitigate effects of climate change. But then someone would make a comment like, we have bigger things to worry about, and these bigger things to worry about is we need money for food. Not knowing that this satellite can actually lead to food security or making decisions that actually ensure there is food security. Same thing with disaster management. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. Thank you so much. Before Dr. Nura, I hope Dr. Nura would not mind, just discussing about the progress and the work with Swahili before he comes up, just to have our minds to some of the things that were discussed. So I was just thinking about about what you were saying about people that are aggressive, or military space and civil space, Mr. Etim. And I think it's quite important, in addition to what John Mark has said, how do we get our people in the decision making when it comes to finances and money? Because the truth is, at the end of the day, if the people that are making these decisions don't even understand. That's why space communication is something we should really prioritize in the industry, because at the end of the day, how much funding that we get would be dependent whether or not we want to agree on maybe the Senate and the people in charge of the budget and the presidency. And it's very important, and it's high time we start thinking about how do we get more people in those positions to be space aware. Because if we have a situation where members of the Senate, those in the presidency, those where people where at the end of the day it comes down to them signing the check, speaking in informal terms, if they don't know about space, or if they don't really understand, then space is really political at the end of the day. So maybe going forward, as people involved in space in Africa, we should be thinking about getting very political as well, getting our people there, or convincing their people there quite directly, having this political one-on-one engagement with them, and hopefully that can change in our individual countries as well. Yeah, Dr. Noura, please, if you're there. We still have a few minutes, and we can take one or two more questions. If anybody has any question or contribution, please feel free to raise your hand or send a message. We'll be very, very glad to have you. And again, on space narrative, John Mark, if what do you think about there's this slogan being used by the AUC that I really like as well? Dr. Otara would say space is the new El Dorado. Africa is the new El Dorado for space business. If we can take that and claim it and try to project that more as an industry, I think it might be really good to just say, oh, we have the demographic factors, we have this land space, we are the new El Dorado for space business. What do you think about that slogan, that narrative?
Yeah, I think really sorry, just a moment.
No, it's okay.
So when it comes to slogans, they actually have a way of making an impact, especially mentally. Because one thing about having a good slogan is it has to be catchy, it has to be memorable, and it has to sort of inspire some confidence in whoever is saying it. So I feel like it has a greater impact than give it credit to have. And then just on that is, I don't know if it's the wrong thing that we started with, but I feel like had we started venturing into space from the African perspective with awareness instead of just going head first into all these things, then maybe we would have been in a different position altogether.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow, that's profound. So it's like we took the top, how do they say, the top down approach. So we just started with launching satellites and everything, and we really didn't. It was more on the science aspect. The public was never very engaged in the beginning, and now we're really just trying to see how we can patch it all back off.
Yeah, and just to make a light joke on a light note is, just because it worked with the Big Bang, it doesn't mean that it will work with a different approach. Because you see, the idea is there was this small point, and then there was the Big Bang, and then everything just started to go down. So sometimes it's important to start from the bottom and build your way brick by brick after setting this foundation. So assuming if maybe from the South African perspective, Nigerian perspective, Kenyan perspective, if we had started with an aggressive approach towards spreading or creating the awareness about why space is important, and actually having, I don't think if these, and maybe Mr. Etim, you can correct me because I know you're into policy and strategy.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's a point where we actually considered having public participation before establishing maybe an agency or a space program. Because I feel like since it works with different other documents, then that way the public would have a way
Yeah.
that we were approached with this, we had something to say about it, and we influenced its creation. So I also
Yeah.
feel like if someone has this tangible idea that they made an impact through such an initiative, then it would leave them more open towards accepting something.
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
profound approach. Mr. IT, would you like to respond to that?
Thanks, John Mark. And I think, like Nelly said, that's actually a reasonable way to go. But like you also mentioned, many African countries did not take that path. Kind of the issue of maybe we are kind of in a hurry to do some things or catch up with some things. So really, public consultation is really very important when it comes to space. And not just for the upstream, I mean, even for the downstream, the issue of space applications. If you carry people along, it will be easier for them to support you. I think, in fact, if you look at even when people are making policies, they don't do public consultation. Sometimes it's just a few people that just gather together to just put out something. And that's why there's no buy-in from the public, and there's a pushback from the public. So, I mean, I think that's one of the communication strategy, definitely. We need to carry the public along. You need to engage in each step of the way. So I agree with you.
Yeah, profound. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Aitin, for chipping in that contribution. And yes, I don't see any more hands-on up anymore. Okay, so we are right. We are right on time. I'm just going to share my screen. Today's webinar has been very interesting, and just to go over some of the things that we've discussed, I think Mr. John Mark has already mentioned that he'll make the slides available. So thank you so much for that, because I think there are like very key points there, and some of the tips and the strategies were just clearly pointed out there. Storytelling, making it relatable, using graphics and social media. I think we have to use social media more. Yeah, I hardly see anything. The space industry, like the space sectors, really feel like uptight professionals. So not like stuff like TikTok videos and things like that. We're kind of like, very LinkedIn. So it was nice to see TikTok there, although I personally don't use it myself, just to show you how, what we are talking about. But those are when people are like millions and millions of people, and all the people we could reach, using social media as well. And also, apart from communicating outside the industry, how we communicate inside has also been discussed. And, just making those moves for networking, following up, active listening, active speaking, very important tips. And I think after this whole dialogue on space communication, hopefully we've inspired one or two of our guests here. If you're interested in communicating space to your local community, or to your university, or as a professional space communicator like Mr. John Mark Ochen and probably myself, we'll be very glad to have you. It's just about reaching out to people in ways that they can really understand that, okay, this is important. It's not for the hype and, the global hype for space, but it's really just about, making a difference in Africa. I think that approach is how we always like to take it. And we've really discussed about that today. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening in. And for our upcoming webinar, and it's good for September. Date and time will be communicated very soon to all our guests. But we'll be talking about leading space economists in the African space industry, and we'll be starting with Egypt. We'll be having a senior director of space programs at the Egyptian Space Agency. Talks to us about everything going on in the Egypt space sector, hosting APSA and some of the very, very interesting things that Egypt is doing in the space industry. And we'll be very happy to have you guys join us then as well. So we'd like to hear from you. If you check the link we sent to you on WhatsApp, you'll see that we sent on WhatsApp and the email the webinar survey form. Please do try to fill that form and join our WhatsApp community. I'm going to post the WhatsApp group once again before I end the meeting so that those that are not the group can follow up. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter as well. So we'd like to hear from you and just be in touch with you as well. So thanks for joining myself and Mr. John Mark today. It's quite an interesting dialogue. And thank you for coming as well, Mr. John Mark, and just sharing all these really interesting strategies and tips with us. Do have a lovely weekend, everybody. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone, and thank you for attending.
Yeah, John Mark, don't forget to share your LinkedIn on the group for those that want to follow you on social media. I think we mentioned that at the beginning of the call. If you would just help with that as well.
Mark, go and share.